Well, welcome. I'm Rufus Black, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Tasmania, and it is a pleasure to be introducing this session on Transformative Reimagining, Sustainable Higher Education for Equity and Social Justice. The Accord unmistakably puts equity at the very centre of the future of our higher education system. It's a beautifully designed piece of policy architecture designed not just to transform our economy, but perhaps more importantly, our society. Every one of our institutions has its own equity story of the opportunities and possibilities that an equity transformation will mean for the communities that we're a part of. The only community I can speak of is the community that is in our world. In fact, we have multiple communities, so let me just give a snapshot from Hobart. Often we get visitors to Hobart who commonly reflect on what a beautiful and wonderful place it is, transfixed by its mountains and its waters and its colonial buildings. But that facade, as across the rest of Australia, hides a more troubling truth. Our Sandy Bay campus is, if you like, in the Double Bay or Toorak of Hobart. And the troubling reality of it is, for every kilometre you travel from that campus, life expectancy drops a year. So you travel in the course of the suburb range of Hobart from a life expectancy in the high 80s to a life expectancy 20 kilometres away of 67. That is like travelling between Monaco and Eritrea. In the space of one city, that equity gap is enormous, and it's place-based, it's deeply locational, and the divide is huge. And higher education is at the core of it. To travel those same miles is actually to be travelling a drop of over 50 points of higher education attainment, from 53% level of tertiary qualification down to just 3%. These are the divides that the Accord invites us to address and overcome. But as we do that, it is an invitation to a more radical imagining. And that's what this session is about and why we're so privileged to have Penny here. Because for a suburb like Gagebrook to change from 3% higher education to 50, and there are many places in Tasmania in that below 10% range, is a transformation of that place. But actually, for that to happen, it has to be a transformation of our place and of what it means to do higher education. And that's really the invitation we've got. That kind of radical transformation is a transformation of institutions and of the system, and we have probably barely begun that task of imagining. So Penny today issues us with an invitation, a challenge to engage in that imagining. As the UNESCO Chair in Equity, Social Justice and Higher Education Global Innovation, we're fortunate to have Penny with us and a part of our system. So let me turn over to Penny to offer a range of thoughts and provocations to us, and then we'll invite questions and engagement. Penny, welcome.
Thank you, Rufus. Thank you very much, Rufus, and thank you everyone for being here this afternoon at the end of what has been probably a very intensive day, starting early this morning. And it's such a great honor to be invited as keynote speaker at this year's University Australia Summit. And I thank the organizing committee for the privilege and opportunity to be part of the ongoing conversations about the perplexing and challenging problem of creating equitable higher education, and perhaps even more importantly, generating sustainable higher education for equity and social justice. I want to acknowledge the immense leadership and knowledge in this room and the collective work across the sector to build more equitable and inclusive institutions. I would also like to acknowledge that I live, work, and have prepared this keynote from a Awabakal land, and I pay my deepest respects to Indigenous leaders, elders, and people in Australia and across the world. I acknowledge the Ngunnawal people who are the custodians of this beautiful land for which we are meeting upon this afternoon. And it is impossible to consider developing equitable higher education without acknowledging the colonial histories embedded in global educational systems and ensuring that we generate higher education that foregrounds and respects and embeds and recognizes the knowledge, wisdom, and values, I should say, of First Nations people. Repositioning higher education as a force for equity and social justice can be at the heart of these important commitments. Equity is not peripheral to higher education practice. It is a profound part of all that we do. The work of equity requires us to reflect deeply on the directions we are taking and what values underpin those directions. As a society, we are facing profound and urgent issues, of which widening inequalities are a massive challenge. And so, there is an imperative for us to reimagine higher education and its key role in the face of such confronting social issues. Experiencing a global pandemic has helped uncover our human and more than human interdependency. It has forced us to pause and contemplate new approaches. And yet, we are all too quick to recover the Tina effect, the narrative that there is no alternative. In a rush to recovery, we forget to ask critical questions about what forms of higher education we want to enable, for whom, and why. I'm hoping that yes. So, I really want to activate our collective imagination through critical questioning. What is the purpose of higher education? Who participates and on what terms? What has equity and social justice got to do with it? And how might we reimagine higher education as a vehicle for equity and social justice? The collective act of critical questioning challenges the status quo and activates our capacity to imagine new possibilities. Critical questioning enables visionary thinking. It helps us make rich, nuanced, and textured connections to better understand ourselves as continuously formed in relation to others, including those who have been historically excluded from projects of higher education development. The urgencies of our time are a matter for higher education. The multidimensional, multiscalar, social and ecological crises facing communities across the globe alert us to the crucial role of higher education in contributing to sustainable and equitable transformation of and also beyond our institutions. UNESCO calls, and I'll quote from UNESCO, calls for higher education institutions and their stakeholders to systematically rethink their role in society and their key missions and reflect on how they can serve as catalysts for a rapid, urgently needed, and fair transition towards sustainability. The complexity of the issues at stake means that solutions should be part of a radical agenda that calls for new alliances and new incentives. As Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, explains, and I quote him, "We must work for solutions rooted in justice with renewed urgency and solidarity." Higher education is not outside of complex geopolitical dynamics. These dynamics impact all dimensions of higher education. Equity is not a separate issue, but is part of the social fabric in which we create the conditions for our collective sustainability, flourishing, and well-being. We have engaged in an extensive process of reviewing our higher education system through the Australian Accord process. As chair of the Accord, Professor Mary O'Kane asked a fundamental question during this process, and I quote her, "If we can't reform our own system, then what can we do?" The final Accord report asks us to refresh our thinking in relation to bold systemic reform. We urgently require securely and comprehensively funded systems with visionary thinking that expands the view of our purpose of higher education, while calling on governments, policymakers, and civil servants to recognize their role in creating such possibilities. Universities and their leaders have a key role to play, and those with the power to influence change must do everything in their power to create the conditions for equity, and thus for our sustainable futures. we must pay attention to who participates in transformative processes and on what terms. This requires critical consideration of the insidious inequalities that are regularly ignored, silenced, and rendered invisible through a preoccupation with measurement as holding all the answers. An example is the way we continuously invoke the metaphor of a barrier, an overused terminology in educational policy and practice. This metaphor ignites our social imagination that the problem of equity is relatively simple to fix as long as we figure out how to measure it. Barriers are tangible, concrete things that are observable and thus easy to quantify and measure. The idea that we can fix the problem of equity through measurement is so seductive that we then ignore the insidious inequalities that are rooted in the very foundations of higher education, even as we seek to build equity within it. We lose sight of the ethical dimensions of what we do in the name of equity and how we do it. A powerful way that insidious inequalities are sustained is through what I call deficit imaginaries. This refers to the idea that equity interventions must correct the perceived deficiencies of individuals constructed through the lens of disadvantage. The problem is located in the bodies of those targeted by equity policy and practice, thus reproducing hierarchies between those granted the power and influence to construct and implement policy and those for whom policy is projected. Dominant temporal structures privilege quick-fix approaches that oversimplify rather than develop long-term commitments in which equitable and participatory processes and relations can be developed and sustained. Through deficit imaginaries, particular aspirations and identities are privileged and valued. There is sometimes a slippage into a quasi-medical discourse that sets out to provide so-called treatment to those with perceived impoverished aspirations and identities, while ignoring the implications of who is seen to know and who is seen to lack. This is reflected in evaluation methodologies that foreground random control trials to measure the impact of the treatment provided or withheld, or evaluation narrowly framed to measure what works while ignoring the systems of inequality and injustice that produce the conditions for intergenerational disadvantage. Deficit imaginaries have led to a legacy of educational policy and practice committed to raising aspirations through outreach programs. The idea that historically underrepresented people and communities lack aspiration is unacceptable and pathologizing. Equity can too easily become reduced to a set of crude interventions focused on changing individuals constructed through disadvantage, with minimal attention to the historical, intergenerational, and deeply entrenched multidimensional inequalities in which aspirations and identities are formed, validated, and enabled. The effects can be detrimental, widening inequalities rather than creating the social and institutional conditions for parity of participation. Indeed, conceptions of parity are too often one-dimensional, strongly framed by a quantitative conception only. This reinforces deficit imaginaries by counting numbers of people within one-dimensional policy categorizations, driven by questions such as how many students from low socioeconomic status backgrounds enrolled in higher education in a particular year. We lose sight of the root problem. Questions such as, what are the social and economic structures that reproduce the conditions in which there are growing inequalities that affect educational access and participation? How do these social and economic inequalities affect how different people, knowledge, and forms of learning are unequally recognized, represented, and valued in society and in higher education? And what are the effects of these multidimensional inequalities on human and more than human flourishing and well-being? In short, we need a reframing of notions of parity of participation to challenge deficit imaginaries. A social justice reimagining of parity of participation substantially deepens engagement with equity by examining the implications of who participates and on what terms. Nancy Fraser explains that parity is not a matter of numbers, it is a qualitative condition of interacting with others on an equal footing. So what is to be done? How do we move away from deficit imaginaries couched in one-dimensional approaches to parity of participation? How do we challenge insidious inequalities that are reproduced through inequitable education systems? How do we move forward in solidarity to create the conditions for higher education to be mobilized as a force for equity and social justice and our collective, sustainable futures? I propose a multidimensional framework for equity that offers vital insights to challenge insidious inequalities. These dimensions, when held together, shift our focus from individual remediation and assimilation to the social, economic, cultural, and representational inequalities that damage our system, our communities, and ourselves. So, number one is redistribution. Redistribution seeks to redress social and economic inequalities, the intergenerational maldistribution of educational opportunities, life chances, and key resources. Access to quality resources and opportunities is imperative to full and meaningful participation in higher education and lifelong learning. But this must be held together with recognition, which challenges the inequitable cultural value order that leads to status subordination through deficit imaginaries. This requires moving beyond tokenistic celebrations of diversity to recognize the knowledge, experiences, and identities that students bring, which both enrich and transform local, institutional, and sector-wide tertiary education communities. Representation, again held together with redistribution and recognition, develops programs collaboratively with students and communities as peers rather than recipients. It demands rigorous and ethically oriented co-design and co-development with those who have been denied a voice in the development of higher education and its social contribution. Fourth, human and more than human flourishing and well-being demands a broader conception of higher education beyond economic-centered notions and towards its broader contribution to generating collective, equitable, sustainable futures for us all. It recognizes the commitments of students who see higher education not only as a pathway for their future well-being, but also for the future well-being of others. It recognizes the responsibility and contribution of universities to the local, regional, and global communities that they serve. It recognizes our interdependency and the different knowledges, capabilities, and values that constitute an equitable and inclusive higher education system. And fifthly, methodological rigor, which avoids collapsing research, evaluation, and programmatic development into instrumentalized methods and considers the ethics of what we do and how we do it. It emphasizes participatory practice with a deep commitment to ongoing dialogic cycles of critical reflection and critical action. It values the time required to do equity carefully, collaboratively, sustainably, and ethically. This multidimensional framework underpins the UNESCO Chair in Equity, Social Justice, and Higher Education, which is based in the Center of Excellence for Equity in Higher Education, or CEHE for short, at the University of Newcastle. A key project of the UNESCO Chair team focuses on multidimensional inequalities and its manifestation in gender injustice and gender-based violence, what the United Nations calls the shadow pandemic. Globally, 1 in 3 women will experience gender-based violence in their lifetime. 1 in 3 women. In Australia, 1 in 4 women have experienced violence by an intimate partner since the age of 15. But this rate is higher for women from socioeconomically disadvantaged areas, women with disability, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, LGBTQI+ communities, and women living in rural and remote areas. Gender-based violence is estimated to cost Australia about $22 billion each year. These numbers are staggering and reveal that we have a long way to go to building equity. Last year, all levels of Australian government launched a national action plan to end gender-based violence. Just this past week, education ministers published an action plan addressing gender-based violence in higher education. These developments are immense in recognizing the social epidemic that is devastating to our society and communities. Now is the time to seize higher education's crucial contribution in actively challenging injustice and its manifestation in violence as part of its broader commitment to equity. Although the profound detrimental and long-term effects of gender-based violence on all dimensions of personal and social health and well-being has been strongly articulated over recent years, the impact of experiences of gender-based violence on higher education access and participation remains largely a silent issue. To redress this, the UNESCO chair team have conducted research with 430 student victim survivors in the Newcastle region and have found that gender-based violence profoundly undermines higher education equity in a whole range of ways. We found that the majority of gender-based violence experiences happened in students' own or someone else's private residence. On average, students first experience gender-based violence at age 13. Student victim survivors aspire to use their university education to help other victim survivors and to make a difference to their families, communities, and society. The students valued the opportunity to participate in higher education, but this was countered by a profound sense of alienation, not belonging, unworthiness, and isolation. Bertram and Crowley describe this as insidious trauma, which does harm to the soul and spirit. Insidious trauma is deepened by institutionalized forms of misrecognition. This is the combined impact of stigmatization with deficit imaginaries. The silencing of gender-based violence as an issue of institutional significance reinforces a personal sense of not belonging articulated by many of our participants. And there's a number of examples on this slide. So why am I studying this degree? Like why? How could I be of use to anyone? You can't get over this feeling of you're not worthy. You don't even deserve to be here. Maldistribution was a major factor in undermining students' capacity to flourish. Students suffered profound financial deprivation as well as restrictions on their freedom. Rigid policies such as compulsory attendance as well as the burden of large student debt exacerbated by severe disruption to their studies was a major theme emerging from the survey data. Students made important recommendations to the university on this basis, as illustrated on this slide. And I won't read all of these quotes, but just to give you a sense. After I experienced domestic violence, I was homeless, living in my car, and I did my first ever final exams at university the day after sleeping in my car. Please excuse our attendance rates for compulsory tutorials. We are often going through wars at home that no one knows about. Attendance in the middle of one of them could mean additional violence for us. The students' insights teach us how redistribution, recognition, and representation might be held together to guide transformation for equity. The students provided powerful recommendations to university leaders and policymakers, and I've got some of these on the slide, but we're still working through the 430 qualitative responses to make sure that we provide the most comprehensive recommendations based on students' experiences, but here are some of them. Providing quality education for staff and students about gender-based violence, building capacity and new forms of expertise to address and combat gender-based violence, taking an explicit stance against all forms of injustice, including gender-based violence, ensuring costs of study are covered, safe accommodation is available, and free healthcare and legal services are available, creating flexible and responsive time structures and inclusive pedagogical, curricular, assessment, and support frameworks and practices. And there's more. So this is just amazing. They had so much to say to the university about what could be done differently. So avoid punishing students suffering coercive control and restrictions on their mobility. Provide navigational support to ensure access to key support services, resources, opportunities, and pathways. Exercise zero tolerance of stigmatization and reform policies that lead to excessive debt, withdrawal, and poor educational profiles. Through the collaboration taking place under the UNESCO chair, which includes research, evaluation, new programs, student advocacy, relational navigation, and interagency collaboration, we are producing critical knowledge and action to mobilize higher education in its capacity to contribute to gender justice, higher education equity, and to challenge gender-based violence. A key role is providing a platform for students to articulate their knowledge and their insights to create collective action for social change and to build capacity for new forms of expertise for long-term sustainability. The UNESCO chair team at the University of Newcastle is collaborating with student victim survivors and community service agencies to build a gender justice hub which aims to produce new knowledge to understand the extent and nature of gender-based violence amongst higher education students, ensure the voices of victim survivors inform an improved higher education sector, produce an evidence base with specialist community services to support increased resourcing that enables access to lifelong learning and higher education and capacity building for our future. Develop models for partnership with higher education students and future students to support their educational journeys, life chances, and to build collective capacity, knowledge, and action. Help improve higher education policies, procedures, and curriculum, preparing the next generation of professionals to understand the complexities of gender injustice and its manifestation in gender-based violence. Challenge universities and other professional organizations to become change drivers in the fight against gender-based violence, and recognize the knowledge, insight, and capacity of students for societal and institutional transformation. The Gender-Based Violence Project is one case study of many that illuminates how social, economic, cultural, and representational injustices, when ignored, can sabotage our collective efforts to build equity. Challenging ourselves to move from one-dimensional models to rigorous, multidimensional frameworks enables us to dismantle harmful and insidious deficit imaginaries. When inequalities are ignored, they unravel our institutional and personal efforts, investments, and commitments to equity. We need to urgently move towards solutions for higher education rooted in social and ecological justice by fostering a culture of solidarity and compassion. As Valerie Amos said this morning, this means being serious about equity, thinking carefully about the key messages we communicate, and holding ourselves accountable to communities navigating social, economic, cultural, and representational injustices. The UNESCO Chair project I shared illuminates that students have high aspirations to contribute to society, including participating in meaningful paid work that benefits themselves and others. Students and community partners are co-leaders with universities in processes of reframing the purpose of higher education and of contributing valuable knowledge and wisdom from their experiences and their expertise. We simply cannot contemplate a reformed system of higher education that puts equity at the center without recognizing the value of this important body of knowledge. The narrowing of higher education for job-ready, market-centric, commercialized purposes undermines our capacity to eradicate poverty, reduce inequalities, promote gender equity, and build peace, justice, and strong institutions, key sustainable development goals that center equity and social justice. Hyper-individualism, entrenched as it is in a culture of competitiveness rather than collaboration, compassion, and solidarity, is toxic for us all. Overlooking multidimensional inequalities is ultimately damaging for sustainable higher education while doing harm to our students and to ourselves. If we ignore these social imperatives, we ignore our long-term collective well-being. I would like to end by paying special and heartfelt tribute to the participants, team members, and community sector partners in the UNESCO Chair project that I shared. I want to acknowledge the wisdom and knowledge they bring to processes of higher education transformation. And really importantly, the UNESCO Chair scheme is not conceived of as the work of a lone scholar. Rather, UNESCO understands that transformation can only come through collective action, through cooperation, through collaboration, and through meaningful parity of participation in the project of change. It is only together that we can systematically transform higher education for equity and sustainability. Thank you so much for listening, and I really look forward to further conversations about these provocations. I know that there's so much amazing work across the sector around equity, and there's a lot to draw from. So I look forward to ongoing conversations. Thank you very much.
Penny, in what I suspect will be all too short 15 minutes available to us, I'll start with an observation, then turn to a matter of First Nations. It's where you started. It's where I think we should always be starting. And then invite some questions about practice, or what it means in practice, and perhaps a little about capability in the time we have. And I think you probably heard it in the applause, but it's summed up beautifully here. Fantastic presentation. I want to take a moment to call out how well you presented such a sensitive topic with respect and dignity. It's difficult territory to traverse, and it was a wonderful kind of setting of a framework for us to think about. You started it by inviting us to recognise we can't do justice without addressing the questions of First Nations. And there's an observation here, which somebody has just moved off. If you could put the First Nations observation back, please. Well, the observation, I remember it. It was an observation that said we need to ensure that we have First Nations data sovereignty so that AI doesn't get built on kind of Western models that ultimately embed and reinforce prejudices of many kinds, kind of paraphrasing a beautiful observation. Would you just want to make any observations about that and its importance for marginalised groups of that kind of sovereignty?
Yeah, and I think it comes back to the point about what I mean by methodological rigor. Obviously, I have tried to condense, what is a really complex issues. But what I mean by methodological rigor is putting an ethics that deeply underpins everything that we do, even if that's, whether that's research or whether that's programmatic development or evaluation. Recently, I've worked with my colleagues at the University of Newcastle, led by Nathan Towney, our Indigenous Strategy PVC, and currently PVC of the College of Social and Human Futures, on a project with the New South Wales Government Department of Education called Reimagining Evaluation. And that project has taken very, very seriously the processes of meaningful parity of participation in the development of the framework itself, and then how we take that into schools and communities to ensure Aboriginal sovereignty is at the heart of what we do in evaluation. Evaluation is such an important aspect of equity. So we use evaluation a lot to try to maybe measure the idea of what works or impact and so on. But what I mean by methodological rigor is making sure that we put the communities at the heart of the initiatives that we're developing and the evaluation that it's serving at the heart of the process, and ensure that we listen hard and that we exercise a deep sense of reflection on the values that are at play in the evaluation process. So evaluation has value at the heart of it. We often don't look at, or we talk about objectivity, but actually we're all engaged in bringing our values into any context, including evaluation. So making sure that the values of Aboriginal communities are at the heart of what we do. But we can learn from that, and again, it's not a kind of marginal or peripheral concern. That should be brought into all that we do around how we engage these really powerful mechanisms to understand what we're doing and why, and who we're doing it with.
Thank you very much, Penny. And it really takes us, that example, into what's kind of almost our top question, I think, there, which is, what does this look like in action? So you've outlined a series of powerful concepts and a powerful framework. And I know your centre engages in practice as well as research and theory. Perhaps you could share with us 2 or 3 examples that would help us all see what would this really mean if we put that kind of framework into action.
I'll try to be as succinct as possible. So the Centre of Excellence for Equity in Higher Education at the University of Newcastle is a really unique hub. So I talked about the hub for gender-based violence. CEHI for short, it's a hub of activity, and it's a decentered centre. So it really challenges the structures in higher education, which often position practice away from research and theorization. It tries to bring together dialogue across critical reflection and critical action, and all that we do to develop programmatic development. And to try to work in collaborative ways with people who are involved in equity. So I think what the point I was trying to make is that often the gaze is on individuals who are marked by the policy categorizations associated with equity. And the work or the problem is seen to transform them, their attitudes or something about them, their identities, their aspirations. Actually, I think that one of the more important things is to think about ourselves in relatively powerful positions, whether that's leadership or whether that's a lecturer. Or whether that's a community agent who is working with vulnerable groups, that actually how we approach somebody matters a lot. And so, it's really about providing time, resources, and space for people to slow down a little bit and to think about what values and judgments they're making in these moments of power. Even when we don't feel relatively powerful, we actually have influence, and it can make a huge difference to somebody's life.
I was thinking about your University of Newcastle context. What are they doing well?
Well, I think one of the things that we're doing well is to really build meaningful relationships with our community. So, rather than, thinking about outreach differently, and we think about outreach as something that we do with community organizations, community representatives, developing long-term meaningful relationships. Because at Newcastle, we have an incredible set of different initiatives, such as Open Foundation, which is coming up to its 50th year. It's served over 70,000 students in the local region. We have an incredible center for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, Wallatuka. And CEHI works in collaboration to really reinforce those relationships with community organizations, because I think that's where over time we know that the best way to encourage people to think about themselves as lifelong learners is to hear it from somebody that they trust. So, by developing those long-term sustainable relationships with community who are, kind of first to talk to people who are suffering multidimensional inequalities, to say, actually, you could go to university. And we're going to work with the university, we're going to work with a team to be able to identify what services, resources, pathways are available. And we're going to also walk alongside you on that journey and ensure that you don't have traumatic experiences of, for example, cold disclosure and so on. So that's across different kinds of structural inequalities that people experience.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions here building around what level, if that's putting it in action, there are capabilities we need to build. The Cord calls out the need for professional development of academic staff. The question here about if we're engaging in professional development for equity, what would that look like? And there's one specific question there about if we've got 1 in 4 people in the class who's experiencing gender-based or experienced gender-based violence, what does that look like as a perhaps very concrete example of what does it mean to be educated for equity as academics?
And I think it's, like I said, it's about all that we do. So I worry about having a kind of special session on equity. I think it's much more about, having really high quality, I call it embedded professional learning that is actually in the context of people's teaching and research and so on, so that they can make sense of how students experience higher education and have a sensitivity around that and understand, for example, gender-based violence is a manifestation of gender inequity. And those can be the small things. They can be the way that we talk about people in the classroom or in our leadership committees and so on. So having that sensitivity in those contexts is a very important step in developing cultures of inclusivity. And that takes time. I think that if you haven't had those experiences, it's hard to understand what it feels like to have those experiences. One of the things that we're doing at the moment is we have a project that is, it's collecting data, but the data collection process itself is a place for staff and students to pause and to think about how they are experiencing equity initiatives. What does that mean from their perspective? What resources are available or not? What kinds of practices they take up, but also how they feel about it. And this is something that gets suppressed quite a lot of the time. There's a lot of resistance coming up, that people are angry about equity initiatives because they feel perhaps that they might be left out, or they feel hurt because they feel that they've put a lot of effort and time into developing equity, and it's not necessarily recognized, validated, or legitimated as a worthy use of time in the university. So I think it's those kinds of things that enable us to understand the lived experience on an everyday basis that staff and students are going through. One quote that really stands out in my head for a project that we're doing, it's an international project around building equity in STEM. And one woman talks about it in this way. She says that her everyday experiences of gender inequity as a staff member in the STEM area is like a death by 1,000 cuts. And I think those are the kinds of things that that's what I mean by insidious inequalities. So the idea of that project is to bring people together in their disciplinary context and give people the time and space to engage with the anonymized data from that project and think about how it resonates with their own experiences and how, as a collective, within their disciplines, they might be able to advance equity. What are the issues for them? And what can they do together to make a change?
Terrific. Well, in the last few minutes we've got, Penny, the kind of top question, I think it goes the energy in the room for actually making this happen. is systemic change is always daunting. What are the first steps universities can take to start the process of systemic change?
I actually do think professional learning is absolutely key because at the end of the day, it's about our relationships with other people. And so, if staff are not being given the time and the resources and the space to actually think about what this means for them in their everyday practices, there's so much goodwill. People are so deeply committed, but it's daunting. It's very daunting. So I think, we really need to provide that support to be able to enable the cultural change to happen over time. It's not going to be a quick fix. It's not about one-off training sessions. It's actually to embed that. And, quality teaching is important, but we can't have quality without equity. Equity is central to quality teaching. So, in order to build quality, we have to embed equity. That needs professional development. It needs people to work together to be able to realize what they can do to make a change. And I think overall people are extremely willing to do this. They just need a little bit of time and resources and care to be able to think about what that means. And also to be able to articulate their experiences of inequity as well. Because students are very sensitive and they know when staff are struggling with their own experiences of inequity. And so it creates a culture of a culture in which students sense that inequity as well. So it's really important we look after our staff in all of this.
Well, Penny, we've got questions we could take the rest of the afternoon, but we are coming up to time. So can I thank you on behalf of everyone for painting a compelling picture for us, a set of large organising ideas that I think challenge, provoke, and are really generative, that invite us to think about what we do in a much larger and in some very provocative ways. A framework for equity that I think is incredibly, it's compelling, it's relatable, it's actionable, and in this conversation you've given us just a hint of what it could look like if we go down that journey further and fuller, as the Accord really will require us to do. So thank you for your generosity today, and we look forward to hearing more as the sector goes through this journey from you and your wonderful centre. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.